You know, we all think we know the story of the atom. It's the fundamental building block of, well, everything. But what if the official history, the one we all learned in school, is missing a massive, ancient, and maybe even more sophisticated chapter?
Okay, so when we try to trace the origin of the atom, in a typical science class, the story pretty much always kicks off in the exact same place.
Yep, ancient Greece. We're taught all about philosophers like Democritus, who came up with the word atomos, which means uncuttable. He proposed that everything was made of these tiny, indivisible bits. It's a clean, simple, and neat origin story.
But what if I told you that wasn't the only time humanity came up with this idea? Or what if it wasn't even the first? Because, as it turns out, there is a whole parallel history, one that developed completely on its own thousands of miles away, and honestly, in some ways, with even greater philosophical and scientific depth. So let's shift our focus from the Aegean Sea all the way over to the Indian subcontinent, because here, thinkers like Uddalaka Aruni and Maharshi Kanada, not to mention the entire Jain school of philosophy, were developing their own incredibly detailed atomic theories. And some of these might actually predate the ones from Greece.
And they had their own name for it, the paramanu. Now, this wasn't just some vague idea. It was a really precise philosophical term for the ultimate, indivisible, and eternal particle of matter.
What's really incredible is that this wasn't just one single idea. At least two major and very distinct schools of thought popped up, each with its own unique spin on the atom. So let's dive into both of them.
First up, let's meet Maharshi Kanada. His name literally translates to atom eater, which, that tells you pretty much everything you need to know about what this guy was focused on. He's the one who founded the Vaisheshika school, and he laid out the first really systematic blueprint for an atomic reality in India.
And this is where the sheer elegance of their system just becomes so clear. The Vaisheshika school didn't just say, hey, atoms exist. No, they proposed 4 distinct types of atoms: earth, water, fire, and air. And each one had its own unique properties. But here's the crucial part. They came up with rules for how these atoms combined. First into pairs, which they called vyanyuka, and then those pairs would combine into triplets or trianyuka. And get this, they said those were the smallest bits of matter we could actually perceive.
Now, at the same time, there was another totally different approach taking shape. The Jain tradition also developed this incredibly robust atomic theory, but they started from a completely different philosophical place, centered on this idea of pudgala, which basically just means matter.
And this is a whole other way of looking at the problem. For the Jains, there weren't 4 different types of atoms. There was only one. Every single paramanu was identical. So you might ask, where does all the variety in the world come from? Well, they said it comes from the different ways these single substance atoms combine, based on qualities like being sticky or dry. They even thought of the atom as a dimensionless point in space. Just wild stuff.
Seeing them laid out side by side like this really makes it all click. Vaisheshika explains the world using 4 different Lego bricks. Jainism explains it using an infinite number of ways to combine just one type of Lego brick. 2 totally different, but equally profound, solutions to the same fundamental question. So, this all leads to the big, obvious question, right? How on earth did they figure all this out 2,500 years ago without a single particle accelerator or an electron microscope to their name?
Well, the answer is just beautiful, both in its simplicity and in its pure intellectual power. They didn't see the atom directly. They inferred it. It's just like how you can't see the wind itself, but you know it's there because you see the leaves rustling in the trees. They saw the effects of atoms all around them.
They used this powerful logical tool called Anumana, which is basically inference. Think about it. When you dissolve salt in water, it vanishes, but you can still taste it. So something has to still be there, just broken down into parts too small to see. Or, think about grinding a grain into the finest powder you can imagine. Logically, there must be a point where it can't be divided any further, and that final, uncuttable particle, well, that's the paramanu.
So what does all of this actually mean for how we should think about the history of science? Well, it means we need to seriously widen our lens. When you actually put Kanada's theory right next to the traditional Greek model from Democritus, you see some pretty startling differences. And just look at that last row, combination. While Greek atomism was a brilliant idea, it didn't really have a systematic explanation for how atoms actually came together to form everything. The Vaisheshika school, on the other hand, did,
with its whole theory of diatomic and triatomic molecules.
And this wasn't just some flash in the pan. This was a continuous intellectual tradition that stretched over 1,500 years. It went from the early particle theories of Aruni through Kanada's incredible systematization, all the way to later philosophers refining it with new logic in the 10th century.
So the modern scholarly consensus on all this is really clear. These Indian atomic theories developed independently. They were either contemporary with or even older than the Greek ideas, and in many ways, they were remarkably sophisticated and systematic.
So the big takeaway here? The story of science isn't some simple, straight line. It's not a relay race where Greece handed a baton to Europe. It's more like a rich, global tapestry, with brilliant people making amazing, parallel discoveries all across the ancient world.
In the end, that deep desire to break the world down into its smallest pieces, to really understand what we're all made of, that's a universal human quest. It turns out the search for the atom wasn't just written in Greek, but in Sanskrit too.